Welcome everybody. It's past. I see that all our panelists are here, so I think it's a good idea to start on time. So we are, just to remember you, we are in panel 1 for the second session of this morning. In this case, on animal and human relations. We have 3 wonderful papers and speakers from different universities and countries. First, we have Leonie Bossert with an artificial intelligence paper. Then we have Westerlaken and Erik Sandelin with a human exceptionalism paper. And finally, we have Seth Josephson talking about a material-semiotic approach for critical animal studies. As you know, this session is being recorded. You will have, each of you will have 20 minutes. I will alert you when 5 minutes are left, and we will leave the discussion for the end. So let me start introducing Leonie Bossert. Leonie Bossert has, if I am not wrong, just submitted her PhD thesis at Tübingen University in Germany. A thesis entitled Common Future for Humans and Animals. She has been also lecturing the last years on animal ethics, human animal studies, critical animal studies, and environmental ethics. And as I have said, she's going to talk about such a problematic, neglected, and important topic as artificial intelligence as applied to non-human animals. So Leonie, ready for you.
Thanks a lot, Nuria. So I will share my screen with you. Okay.
Perfect.
So first of all, hello from my side as well, and thanks a lot for having me here, being able to discuss my work at this wonderful conference. Today I want to talk about artificial intelligence and animals, and what I'm presenting is a co-work, a paper I have written together with a colleague of mine, Thilo Hagendorf, who unfortunately cannot join us today. And you see the title of the paper, and it is accepted for publication in Technology in Society and will hopefully be published quite soon. Thilo is an expert in machine learning and AI ethics. And yeah, I'm the one doing the animal ethics. So why should we talk about this topic? As you probably all experience, artificial intelligence, AI in the following, these technologies and their fields of application are one of the most discussed developments of recent times, and they are seen to be highly potential for changing societies and for improving social systems like medicine, mobility, or the science. And with nearly all human developments, they also affect non-human animals in many ways. Animals are not just used as models for AI, as we will see later. They are also massively affected by various AI applications. However, within AI research, development, and application, the role of non-human animals is either not debated at all, or it's discussed in the same manner as data usage, thereby implying that animals are nothing more than living resources. Of course, we are all familiar with this, and of course, this is highly problematic. I think here in this panel, I don't have to convince you that it's highly problematic. We probably all agree on this. And within our paper, we want to give an overview of how animals are affected in AI research, development, and application. And secondly, how these technologies are used for helping specific animals. This is also the structure of my talk. And I will start in giving you an overview how animals are used in AI research and development. A very obvious use is that quite invasive animal experiments are done for developing AI technologies and researching on AI, because as you're probably all familiar with, within the field of neuroscience and animal experience are quite common to do. They are seen as necessary for learning more about the brain structure of living beings and for being able to build intelligent machines in an analogous way. So-called deep neural networks are a very important approach for AI technologies nowadays, and they refer to the very common paradigm in AI that we can achieve better AI technologies via modeling a brain. As I said, you are probably all familiar that for research like this on brains and neurons, respectively neural networks, and for being able to better understand how they function, invasive animal experiments are conducted in a massive way. I now spare you the cruel details about how these experiments are done within AI research or research on neural networks, which is highly important for AI development. But as I already mentioned, within AI ethics, these experiments are not discussed at all. It's not that they are discussed and then evaluated as necessary for some kind of higher good. They are just ignored. Also some kind of the animals are the absent reference, like we discussed in the panel before. And in regard to AI technologies, it's still a more or less common also paradigm to see AI as some kind of disembodied technologies, which already is highly problematic due to the very high energy supply these technologies need. But it's, in my view, even more problematic since quite embodied animals are tortured for receiving the knowledge needed to develop these technologies. But apart from dissecting animal brains in a way that helps to improve artificial neural networks, animals are used as benchmarks for AI. Is current AI smarter than a worm, a fly, a mouse, or a monkey? By comparing animal and machine behavior, it's assumed that animals can be reduced to particular performance indicators that can also be used to measure AI capabilities. Again, this is of course a very reduced perspective on animals, which does not do justice to how and what they are. And this perspective is, for example, prominently reproduced at the Animal AI Olympics. The logo of this competition you can see here. It's the picture I put on the slide. This is a competition where AI researchers try to determine who is closest to achieving artificial general intelligence. They are doing this by comparing AI systems with animals' cognitive capabilities, with animals' behavioral flexibility in various domains, with their ability for transfer learning, planning, and problem-solving skills. And here, the animals are serving as a suitable benchmark to measure whether AI technology can handle complex tasks. In contrary, human intelligence is contrasted to animal intelligence and machine intelligence and is seen as a long-term goal that is currently completely out of reach. And with this, obviously, one is reproducing the existing human-animal dualism, which again is not discussed in the AI community at all, and probably maybe they would also not find it very problematic as we do. So I also already mentioned that AI is also applied on animals. So animals play a further role in the AI world as they are controlled by AI. AI builds the foundation of modern surveillance technologies. These technologies are not only directed toward humans, but even more excessively toward non-human animals, and especially, of course, toward farmed animals. The confinement of billions of farmed animals requires technologies that can be employed to monitor, restrict, and suppress these animal agencies, as we are all familiar with. And for doing this, AI technologies can become farmers' new best friend. They are able to analyze animals in regard to, for example, fattening control, disease control, or if necessary, facial recognition. They can automatically detect potential health problems. For example, they are used to detect early symptoms of lameness in cows, and robots are already used for collecting eggs. The purpose of this is to increase the efficiency within the animal industrial complex, increasing profit while even more reducing human work to be done in this industry. And of course, from a critical animal perspective, one definitely has to address this ethically highly problematic application when discussing AI. And we could not stick with just ignoring these highly problematic aspects. But to say also something a bit more positive, AI technologies are also used with the purpose to help individual animals. For example, the project Bird Vision constructs windmills equipped with AI, which recognize nearby flying birds and regulates the rotor blade speed, stopping the rotation when a bird is coming too close for protecting it being killed. AI technologies should also help so-called shelter animals by profiling them for enabling a faster and happier adoption through finding an animal fitting the human adopter's preferences the best, or helping shelter animals by detecting malnutrition of the animal or the likelihood of disease outbreaks in these shelters where a lot of animals are living in a very confined space. But however, most projects where AI technology should help individual animals can be found in the field of species protection. So it's also not about animal protection, but about species conservation, which is, I would argue, a highly anthropocentric field. And there, these technologies are used to help protecting individual endangered animals, for example, individual elephants or other endangered animals. And they should help to gain more details, more data about the lives of these endangered animals we want to protect. And we can do this with gaining more data about them. This also comes in line with some highly problematic issues, because you can clearly see that there is a kind of demarcation line between which animals may benefit from AI technologies and for which animals these technologies will only reproduce their exploitation. So for individuals belonging to endangered species and for potentially companion animals, AI technologies may be used in a manner that benefits them, while farmed animal suppression is carried on with AI. To end with a very, very short outcome, we claim in this paper that AI researcher, developer, and user should be trained to become aware of these ethical challenges that technology bears in regard to non-human animals, because an ethical evaluation can't be complete when it just ignores very important ethical challenges who are at stake. Then second, we claim that the use of non-human animals for AI development, as well as for the applications of AI on non-human animals, should be intensively discussed within AI ethics instead of being ignored. Of course, we would also claim that this use should be stopped, at least for the surveillance purposes in the animal industrial complex and the animal experiments. But since this paper, in this paper, we try to reach out to the AI community, we start with, well, let's say, a softer claim. Yeah, that's for now. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion. And thank you all very much.
Thank you. I did not need to alert you for the 5 minutes because you didn't use all your time. So you will have more time if you want later for the discussion. So we can move to the next presentation. which is, I don't know if Michelle or Erik is going to do it. They will talk about contesting human exceptionalism in design research. And as far as the speakers is concerned, let me give you a few hints. Michelle is a postdoctoral research associate in the Department of Sociology at the University of Cambridge. She's in the field of design, as the paper she's presenting here. Her PhD was in interaction design from Malmö University at Sweden. And Erik Sandelin is a PhD candidate in the same area in art, technology, and design at Konstfack University of Arts, Crafts, and Design in Sweden as well. So you are ready, as I see. You can go ahead. You have 20 minutes and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. So hi, I'm Erik.
And I'm Michelle. Hi.
And as you said, today we'll be presenting the paper Critical Animal Design, Contesting Human Exceptionalism in Design Research.
Quote, my tutors believed I was too subjective and too opinionated in a way. They wanted me to empathize with the meat eaters, even though I was doing interviews with both vegans and meat eaters. They really wanted me to go out and buy leather and almost like go out and be a meat eater so that I wasn't too opinionated in one direction. End of quote.
So this is a quote from Laura, not her real name, a student at the design school attending a master's program with a focus on sustainability. In a recent course on, quote, careful entanglements with other animals, she designed packaging for animal products that would make very visible the origin of the product. So throughout this presentation, we will use quotes from Laura to showcase some of the frictions a design student committed to vegan ethics may experience. So in this paper, we will sketch the landscape of design research that is first and foremost driven by a critique of animal oppression. So we thereby appraise the role and influence of critical animal studies, CAS, in design through tracing the overlaps of CAS and design. And we do this through a mapping and a discussion of design projects that explicitly engage with CAS or vegan approaches. And we hope to make two contributions. First, to assemble a repertoire of designerly tactics, methods, and materials that may be of use for CAS scholar activists, but also to begin to claim a space for a CAS-fueled design as a valid design practice which differs in important ways from other so-called more than human approaches. In other words, to support designers like Laura. So the plan is to briefly state what we mean by design and CAS, and then we present a series of design projects that engage with CAS perspectives in different ways. And then we conclude by trying to draw out how CAS and design could engage in fruitful discussion with one another. So both Michelle and I, we're both trained as designers, and this design term, it covers a wide range of disciplines and approaches, from craft persons to industrial designers, from star architects signing off her latest landmark building to a participatory designer hosting workshops with the neighborhood kids. So here we'll embrace all these activities through two definitions of design. As Herbert Simon says, design as changing existing situations into preferred ones, and also as manifesting potential futures or alternative presents. So these definitions, they bring out four main characteristics of design. Design is future-oriented. It asks, what if? It's about change. To design is to propose a different world. Design makes proposals tangible through various forms of prototyping. And design is inherently affirmative in the sense that a designer must propose something. A designer must say yes. And yeah, and in order to discuss this intersection of design and CAS, we also need to describe what CAS is. And we use Pedersen and Stanesco's framing from their conclusions chapter in The Rise of Critical Animal Studies. So to them, CAS is critical. It's a strand of critical theory. It's the application of critical theory towards actual liberation. CAS is not as in animal studies. It's about real animals, not animals as metaphors or concepts. CAS is activist. There's a strong theory-practice connection. And a scholar working within a CAS vein is therefore a scholar activist who will write as an activist or perhaps design as an activist. CAS is intersectional in that speciesism is entangled with other oppressions such as racism and sexism. And we also note that Pedersen and Stanescu, they end their vision of CAS with a discussion of post-animal studies. Perhaps animals have been studied enough. What if instead of focusing on the animal question, we start asking the human question?
I was very surprised that I was the only one in my class working with animals that we eat, and with the whole ethical dilemma of eating animals and consuming animal products. It was just surprising that it wasn't a bigger topic. When I read the course description, I was very much like, okay, sounds like a vegan project to me. It was the careful entanglement with animals that was the main topic. I was like, slaughter isn't very careful, right?
So there is a growing interest in thinking and doing design beyond the human. As part of a larger animal turn in the arts and humanities, the field of design research has increasingly oriented itself towards multi-species efforts. Notions such as multi-species design, more than human design, biocentric design, or non-anthropocentric design are prominent in contemporary design research, practice, and education. So these various post-anthropocentric approaches, they're often influenced by strands of actor network theory, post-humanism, and new materialist thinking. They're increasingly used as theoretical grounding for design work. But explicit references to critical animal studies are still quite rare in design.
Quote, I Googled a lot of vegan fashion design. It was really difficult to find anything. There was really not a lot at all. And when I did find some vegan critical design, it was really hardcore. I didn't find any designs that were in between. It was really very drastic or nothing at all, end of quote. And so we undertook a literature review with keywords including speciesism, CAS, veganism, and design. And we looked also into different design venues to find existing work and projects. We also did an interview with Laura to ground and to motivate this review. And then we did several mapping exercises ourselves to figure out different categories. And what we found, though, I mean, that was not so much to our surprise, is that there's not a lot of ongoing design research with explicit mention to CAS-specific vocabulary. And there is a lot of design work that engages with animals and with sort of more than human entanglements. But most often, this is not specifically anti-speciesist. But still, we identified 4 different categories that we like to mention. And so in the next few slides, we'll go through a couple of examples from each of these. And so the first category is a wider field of design in which animals are seen as the user or the stakeholder in design processes or products. So this field includes things like pet products or GPS tagging of wild animals or agricultural technologies such as milking systems that have animals as users. And I think it also connects to the previous presentation of AI for animals as well. So there are certain parts of this field that could be said to align itself with some CAS perspective, at least to a certain degree. And this is, for example, like a recent orientation within the fields of architecture, and they're focusing on what they call a nature inclusive design. So this is a skyscraper in Chicago. It's called Aqua Tower by Studio Gang Architects. And this is supposedly designed in a bird-friendly manner. So setting the windows back behind the balconies to avoid birds flying into the building. Or other examples include like green overpasses for wildlife to cross highways, or wildflower parks for bees and other pollinators, and other like urban designs that have animals as central users or beneficiaries of the space. And we think this follows a kind of CAS trajectory in the sense that architecture and design are adapting to the ways in which different urban animals make use of the space. And this can perhaps be put alongside theorists like Donaldson and Kimlicka's concept of design for denizenship and liminal animals. And such examples are really crucial to emphasize for designers because they deliberately materialize less speciesist use of urban public spaces. And a second example in the category of designing for and with animals with a CAS orientation includes elements of participatory design. So this means including animals in the design process to allow them to make decisions about what kinds of design work they would propose. So here we can see a project from the Open University in the UK that consults dogs for the design of home interfaces, such as light switches, as you can see in the right pictures, or doors. So that it may become easier for them to operate these devices. And importantly, the most cited manifesto in this growing research field that is called Animal-Computer Interaction, or also ACI. It's written by researcher Clara Mancini in 2011, and she states that it is important to take a non-speciesist approach to research with animals by, for example, working with informed consent or not doing harm, or only developing and researching technologies that are beneficial to the animals that are involved. And much of the work that has come out of this field, however, it doesn't really reflect this statement. And it works often with technologies for like animal enrichment in zoo environments or working dogs. So even though they may attempt to follow a non-speciesist research approach in their methodologies, they often still operate within wider speciesist norms and structures that are rarely questioned. And I was myself also active in the field of ACI early in the PhD. And then during the second year of my own PhD, I found myself stuck in my design process after doing a really good course actually in critical animal studies in Lund University, because I was trying to come up with non-speciesist design work, but I could only find examples of what it is not. So I was saying no to speciesism, but I was not really sure what I was saying yes to in my design work. And so eventually that was a turning point in my PhD in trying to find out what could be the opposite of speciesism and how we can imagine or materialize multi-species worlds.
So the second category we call prototyping CAS futures. It's not the future of CAS, it's about more or less liberated future snapshots. So designers envision potential futures and alternative presents through prototypes. And a prototype, it can be a sketch or a model of a new product, but it can also be a snapshot from a future where something is different. And when we're discussing future prototypes, we should distinguish between a prototyping strategy, like what medium, material, or format is used to materialize the proposition at hand. And then the proposition itself, what is kind of the content of the design? What is being proposed? And in this case, the prototype format is an oil painting by Hartmut Kiewert. And the proposition is a world where the slaughterhouses and meat stores are closed and farm animals mix with the urban population in a seemingly harmonious way. Designers use prototypes to try out a future before it has happened. So in some other projects, there's a stronger emphasis on embodied, performative, and immersive trying outness. Such as, this is it's called The Trial. It's a lecture performance by artists Josephson and Hapoja. And here the audience is invited to participate in a staging of the fictional Finnish court case called State versus Perho Hunters. So in a not so distant future where wolves have acquired legal standing, some humans stand accused of murder. An alternative reality is manifested, a tangible scenario from a zoopolis where at least some non-human species have won legal recognition. Josephson and Hapoja, they subvert well-known societal institutions and action spaces to present plausible stages for acting out alternative values and novel human-animal relations. So after the attorneys of both the claimant and the accused have presented their cases, the verdict is given by a jury formed by members of the audience. In this immersive prototype, we're invited to take part in rehearsing a future. We get a hands-on experience of what such a future could be like. Another project called Fish Watching is a reconfigured angling practice. So instead of catching fish with hook and lure, the fish watcher captures, in quotes, fish on camera. So fish watching attempts not to harm any fish while maintaining several of the qualities of angling, such as spending time outdoors, the convivial chatting, the suspense, and the tiny triumph of the catch. So fish watching could be seen as a snapshot from a future where hurting fish is deemed unacceptable, but where a surrogate for angling is still in demand. This article from a 2027 Swedish newspaper reports that the national organization Sportfiskarna the National Angling Association, has renamed itself to Fiskskådarna, the National Fish Watchers Association. I quote from the article: "More than half of our members have already switched to catching fish on camera instead of piercing them with a hook," says Bernd Ek, president of the Fish Watchers Association. But using a hookless lure and an existing camera, I can also go fish watching today. It's a different activity, yet still exciting. And fish watching demonstrates that the same concept can be deployed as a speculative prototype of potential futures and as a tiny activist act in the now, activating an alternative present with real effective outcome for the individual animal. So again, engaging with prototypes like this can be seen as rehearsing the future. But a question that kind of lingers is how effective such rehearsals may be in actualizing the potential future.
And a third category of design that asks CAS-related questions can be found in the genre of critical design. So critical design is a genre that challenges preconceptions or cultural and social structures and provokes new ways of thinking about the world. This design position often aligns itself with critical theory and has thereby also addressed our ways of treating animals. And so this is a project called Second Livestock. And here, designer and artist Austin Stewart proposed a product in which farm chickens would be wearing a VR headset to roam around freely in virtual space. In talking about this project, Stewart claims that this solution would enable farmers to raise more chickens closer together while still giving them the mental experience of living in a free roaming environment. And this project went viral around 2014, and it's connected to a website that further makes the case for this innovative product.
5 minutes to go, but you can take a little bit more if you want, because we have insured it before.
Thank you. And so while this design has raised a lot of critical discussion, very few news items that have covered this project actually state that this was an entirely fictional critical design. So the artist made this piece merely to emphasize the cruel animal treatment and not to actually propose this as a solution. So these kinds of design materialize a critique of speciesism through presenting a dystopian scenario. And yeah, this is the website of the Second Livestock project. And so another example of this is a book that won the 2008 Dutch Design Award. It's called Pig 05049 by Christine Meindertsma. And this book tells the story of an individual pig called 05049, and it identifies all the consumer products and everyday items that were made from this animal. So examples range from cheesecake, licorice, and wine made of the pig's skin, to train brakes and aluminium molds, sandpaper and bullets made from their bones. So crucially for designers, this book does not only break down the production process of an individual pig in a visually clinical presentation, it also poses questions regarding the materials that designers actually use in their own projects, such as paint or sandpaper. So this critical design is thereby able to provoke discussions on farm animals and their products for designers in very tangible ways.
So the fourth and final category we call post-animal design interventions. And if you remember the previously mentioned framing by Perez and Estanescu, they closed the chapter by pointing towards the possibilities of what they term post-animal studies. And such critical post-animal studies could, quote, think of human commodification of life and anthropocentric privilege beyond issues of pain and suffering. The term post-animal here applies in two senses. First, in removing the animal from the meat, for example, in the sense of meat surrogates and in vitro meat production. And second, on focusing on the human instead of the animal. What if we concerned ourselves less with the animal question? Haven't they been studied enough? And began to ask the human question. So this strand of CAS, or if we should call it PAS, has been vital for me in my ongoing PhD project, which is tentatively titled A Human Design. And I will briefly introduce two design interventions from this project. The first one is called Eating ET, and it gravitates around a full-scale gluten replica of the famous Hollywood alien, which is barbecued on a spit. And mock ET was created as a replacement for the complicated pleasures of meat eating, including that elusive aftertaste of domination and sacrifice. And hesitating before the plant-based alien may confront the carnivore with their own moral dissonances. How come I care so much for a replica of a fictional alien while gobbling on ice cream, flesh, and cheese produced through the industrialized rape, torture, and murder of non-human animals? The second project is called Meat Addiction Hypnotherapy. So in June last year, I posted this call on Facebook and Twitter. It reads, "Do you want to stop eating other animals, but find it hard to quit? Eating the flesh of others can be addictive. I'm offering free hypnosis sessions in Swedish or English that will guide you towards less harmful eating habits." So the meat hypnotherapy asks the question, what if we regard some human relations to other animals as addictions? If so, what can we do to sever these destructive relations? By signing up for the hypnotherapy, the participants acknowledge their own addictive tendencies. This design intervention strives to critically rethink and remake human-animal relations, not by emphasizing the entanglement of humans with other animals, but through a tactic of an affirmative not, of not eating them, not consuming them, not using them. The hypnotherapy aligns with Patricia McCormack's call for an a-human ethics of grace, of joyful disentanglements from other animals, of retreating, of leaving room for other animals to be expressive outside human signifying systems. And I think the hypnosis sessions can be seen as an example of a post-animal design intervention, turning the critical gaze away from the animals towards human desires.
The other supervisor encouraged me to make a gratefulness campaign so that I would do stickers that says thank you and put them on milk and meat packaging to express gratitude. I found that very strange. It's not like the cows chose to give us their meat or give us a gift in that sense. It might help the humans to feel better about themselves, but it doesn't help the animals and their suffering. So in this paper, we aim to identify the areas of design in which CAS perspectives and strategies are already explicitly undertaken. The goal of this work is to emphasize these practices, to bring together anti-speciesist design work as a growing worldview rather than individual projects only operating at the margins of the field of design. So thereby designers such as Laura, but also ourselves, will be able to build on these existing examples creatively and use them in their own design activism. So we are especially interested in building a repertoire that can help design students to confidently claim a CAS space in relation to the growing post-humanist and welfarist design streams that are also working towards less anthropocentric design work, but in which speciesism often remains normalized in design critiques. And we would also like to emphasize the value of working towards proposals in CAS work. So when working with CAS perspectives as designers, the theories that turn out to be most inspiring are able to both critique speciesism, but also especially work towards positive scenarios. So works like Donaldson and Kimli Katsoapoulis, or Eva Giro's What Comes After Entanglement, or Eva Meyer's When Animals Speak. They are very attractive to designers precisely because they're able to propose theoretical and practical alternatives. So we also wish to invite CAS scholars to continue to contribute such proposals because they are crucial to the field of design. And at the same time, we see that designers are also ought to remain critical to the proposals that they put forward as well. So as we showed in some of the examples, CAS-related design work, which is focused often on individual experience and one-to-one interactions, it's also at risk of lacking critique or ignoring the larger speciesist structures that shape design projects. And so we see a very productive need here for ongoing discussions between CAS and design.
Thank you.
Thank you both. Awesome. You have made a very convincing and inspiring claim for design, for the role of design in animal defense. So thank you so much. So many things to discuss later. Let's move to our last paper by Seth Josephson in this session. Seth is a PhD by Ohio State University. He explains that he splits his time between teaching and working as a public librarian, as well as being a very active animal advocate. He's going to talk here about thinking and feeling with the animal archive, a material semiotic approach for critical animal studies. Seth?
All right, thank you all, and I will share my screen here. Okay. Yes, so partly inspired by my work at the library, but also stuff that I've been thinking about for some time. Wanted to just do a kind of an overview of what a material semiotic approach, as I see it, could be for animal studies, the value that it could have. But first, just to do a land statement here. Of course, I'm coming from the United States here in Ohio, so I like to start off talks with this, and I would like to respectfully acknowledge the territory from which I present as the ancestral home of the Shawnee, Miami, Lenape, and Wyandot peoples. We pay our respects to ancestors, elders, and relations past, and search for collective healing and true reconciliation for Indigenous people in the present and emerging. So the tasks of critical animal studies, many are familiar with this Journal for Critical Animal Studies and the statement that was put forward by the Institute for Critical Animal Studies. So I wanted to see where a material semiotics might fit into this project. And of course, as we're very familiar with, the project of critical animal studies is generally a kind of a scholarship and activism that works together to challenge the human-animal binary, to advocate on behalf of non-human animals and their liberation, while also recognizing the interconnection with other forms of oppression. So in Best and others' statement about the idea of critical animal studies for the Institute and the journal, they say a few things that I wanted to emphasize. One is that this idea that it rejects pseudo-objective academic analysis by explicitly clarifying its normative values and political commitments. So this ethical and political investment in the project of scholarship, rather than a pseudo-objective stance of maybe pure reason or pure empiricism that we might see in other forms of animal studies. And they say it's a necessary and vital alternative to mainstream animal studies that reduce animals to reified signs, symbols, images, words on a page, or protagonists in a historical drama. So animals are not mere signs. But on the other hand, it pursues interdisciplinary collaborative writing and research. So CAS nevertheless consists largely of sign making about animals. Research, writing, those are semiotic activities. So while animals are not mere signs, nevertheless, we use signs to communicate and to speak about these beings that we care so much about. So I see two interrelated material semiotic tasks overall. We could think about our work in terms of knowledge production, creating a critical animal archive with original research, empirical, theoretical, historical, etc., considering the status of non-human animals or the possibilities of the future, like the last talk talked about. And especially I'm inspired by participatory action research from artists and activists doing the work of animal advocacy, like the design talk gave good examples of that. And then the other piece, which is arguably more important, although more humble, therefore often overlooked, is critical curation, just the selective collection and representation of material from CAS and non-CAS archives for new audiences. So again, the last talk gave a good example of that by representing material, a kind of curation of design projects that had come before. So that's part of what I'm interested in. I mean, one can produce knowledge through many methods, but crucial to that is a representation of work that's already been done in various forms. So to just give you kind of an overview of what I'm talking about with material semiotics, and some of you may be familiar with this, some not, and you can, if you're familiar with it, you can see what the work that I'm putting together, and maybe where I'm departing from a few other prominent forms of material semiotics. But overall, the material semiotics project is to be against the idea that meaning can exist outside of material things. This idea is deeply rooted in Western philosophical and legal traditions, a dualism of mind and matter. You know, we had in the Western traditions, you know, Neoplatonism for thousands of years, and Christian philosophy and others that had an idea of a soul or a world of forms that could exist outside of matter that was in a sense primary. But a material semiotics resists that. Catherine Hales, for example, she points out that with significant exceptions, print literature was widely regarded as not having a body, only a speaking mind. So that's reflected in, for example, how copyright law is written. It's typically not about the material form that a certain work of art or writing takes, but it's as if it were bodiless, but only existing in a non-material way. And a lot of that today in our scholarship, a lot of sort of non-material semiotics or semiotics in a more traditional form is rooted in Saussure's semiotic tradition that took linguistic signification as the paradigm for all sign making. So Saussure, of course, looked at language as the primary form of sign making. And for him, the signifier has no natural or inevitable relationship to the signified. Its linkage is arbitrary. So for example, the word foot doesn't mean anything without a system, a language, English in this case, where it refers to, a certain body part. There's nothing essential to the sound or the written word foot that links it to the object that it signifies. It's just that it works within a symbol system in order to make that reference. So that was Saussure's paradigm for semiotics. And there, the assumption that the signifier and the signified relation is arbitrary is inherited by structuralism. It's often inherited by post-structuralism. So many of the theorists that we engage with, although there's growing bodies resisting this, but we inherit a lot of these basic ideas about what sign making is and how it works that takes language as the paradigm. So this theory of meaning making removed from matter excludes, among other things, it excludes the world-making powers of non-human animals and other beings who may be semiotic beings, but not necessarily linguistic beings. So material semiotics inherits a counter tradition that existed within the West, but also that comes from an array of non-Western systems of thought and meaning making. And it's a tradition that asserts that there's a necessary relationship between sign and matter. Kind of slogan for this that I like, also drawing from Catherine Hales, this idea of no ideas but in things, from the Imagist poet William Carlos Williams. No ideas but in things. The only way that ideas can exist or manifest is in bodies, in objects. And William Carlos Williams specifically influenced land sculptors like Robert Smithson, Spiral Jetty, but sculptors have long recognized that ideas exist in things. And it's others who are coming to that realization now. Another element that I would weave into a material semiotics is the idea that knowledge is always situated. We can look to Haraway for this idea, but we can also look to Charles Sanders Peirce, who I'll talk about in a second. And the idea is that rather than Saussure's idea that a sign was made up of the signifier and the signified, we crucially have to have the interpreter as the third part that unifies signifier and signified or draws that connection. It's the meaning making for whom that a given sign has meaning. And it in this way, it locates meaning making always in bodies, whether it's a human body or an animal body, or possibly an AI that is nevertheless materially embodied in some kind of machine. We need to recognize that sign making is always situated in a particular perspective from a particular interpreter's perspective. And then another key kind of piece that's really been helpful for me in thinking about the ways that how we get out of a Saussurean semiotics into thinking of more broadly in a material semiotics is the Peircean idea of the three kinds of signs. He was an American pragmatist who died in 1914, but his ideas have kind of had a revival, especially with Eduardo Cohn's Anthropology Beyond the Human work. But others have recognized the value of more kinds of signs than just symbols. So for a kind of Peircean approach, we think of a linguistic sign within a symbol system where the signifier and signified are linked by their relationship within that system, and where there's an arbitrary connection between the signifier and the signified. That's the primary sign-making method of human language. That's mostly what we think of when it comes to human language. That's not all that human language does. There's other elements of iconic and indexical forms within human language. But when we think of, for example, the word like bike, bicycle, it doesn't directly relate to the object, but we know what it means because of its relationship to other signs within a given human language, in this case, English. But Peirce had the insight that there's other forms of signs that do have a direct relationship to the thing that they signify. One of those is the icon, which is connected by resemblance within a given sensory system. So if I have a visual sensory system like our own, the dominant human form, then the image on the right, the icon of the bicycle, resembles the bicycle directly. We don't need a given system of symbols to understand that, although there's an element maybe of symbolic understanding there. But what we need is a sensory system whereby that image resembles the bike that exists out in the world. And then the third kind is the index, an even more fundamental form of sign making, where an object, the signified, is connected to the signifier through some kind of causal connection of quantity or direction of a trace. So for example, the tracks that a bicycle make in the mud is an index of the bicycle. It represents the bicycle not because it exists in some simple system, and not because it resembles the bicycle, it doesn't look like a bicycle, the mark on the ground, but because it is causally connected to the bicycle, it is left behind, it's a trace, and the quantity or direction of the trace signifies the quantity or the direction of the object. We can see that if there's a bunch of marks, we can see that many bikes have passed here, or perhaps that the bike passed by recently, it's a fresh track. So that's a kind of indexical way of thinking about semiotics, of signification. So together, seen from this perspective, all life is semiotic. All living beings, even beyond the animal, but we're focusing on the animal here, is semiotic. There's trace making and trace following. Even an amoeba follows a given trace towards food, and that's a form of indexical meaning making. And then there's iconic representations that a given being might identify. Something resembles something else, and so can recognize it as connected to that thing. And then, of course, there are examples outside of the human of symbolic meaning making. For example, the bee that does a certain dance in order to guide other bees, you could say, is within a given symbol system. Or there's maybe even more clear examples of that. But the point is that if we have a broader sense of what semiotics is, then it's not limited to only linguistic forms or language-like forms of sign making and meaning making, but it includes all these other forms that all living beings participate in. And so here, something like Jakob von Uexküll's idea of the Umwelt, the environment that all living beings create within themselves and in their space. So all living beings are world makers in a sense, materially or interacting materially and semiotically with their environments, as well as creating an internal virtual model of other worlds within themselves, a theory of what's out there as a kind of semiotic process of creating an inner representation of an outer world. So all living beings do that, especially all other animals. So on top of that, to gather those things together, I want to insert here the idea of the archive. And I think the best work that I've seen on the archive that inspires me the most is in queer theory. And so let me talk a little bit about that. So the idea of the archive here is that it's, simply put, it's the places where the sources are. Whatever type of research we're doing as CAS scholars or activists, we're drawing from a collection of materials, whether that's other academic papers or maybe the recorded testimonies of individuals or what have you. Maybe it's representations online. It's a traditional archive, a bunch of boxes with papers in a room somewhere that we're unpacking and going through. Any of those forms of archives, they're the places where the sources are for whatever project we're engaged in. And we might more generally think of the archive as a body of traces that are left behind and collected. First of all, a body of traces that are left behind by a given being or activity, whether that's intentionally created and collected or not. And one can look at the archive of the tracks of the bicycle, for example. That's a kind of archive of multiple forms of trace making. But when we think of the practice of archiving, then that's the intentional preservation of a collection of traces with a hypothetical future in mind. So again, this idea, as we saw in the last talk about this idea of thinking into the future here, the archiving as an activity is necessarily one where we imagine a future interpreter who's going to unpack that, whether that's our own personal archives that we create as scholars and imagining ourselves in the future, unpacking it and working with it, the books on the shelf or what have you, the archives that we create digitally, all kinds of things, or it's a more public archive where the future interpreter is someone else, maybe future generations that may be going back to the material that is collected. So Anne Kvekovic is a key figure in this, thinking about the archive and the queer archive in her work, The Archive of, or An Archive of Feelings. She says that archives are repositories of feelings and emotions which are encoded not only in the content of the texts themselves, but in the practices that surround their production and reception. This is important too because it includes emotions, a non-linguistic form of meaning making, and an indexical or at times iconic way that we connect to one another. And also the fact that she's talking about not just the materials that are in the archive, but the practices that surround their production and their reception, and I would add their preservation into future generations.
5
So
minutes
for her,
to go. 5 minutes to go.
5 minutes. Okay, very good. So the queer archive, some have argued, is this or identifies the embodied nature of memory with the transmission of cultural knowledge through bodily practices. And Kvekovic says that scholars are working as much to produce an archive as to analyze one. So all of our work is the collection of an archive as we write, as well as the analysis of an existing archive. So Anne Kvekovic was interested in the lesbian herstory archive as one of her sites. So that's why the image there is on the right. But others have talked about how queer archives are often soiled and untidy, and that a queer archive activism is a relation to the archive that remains alert to its absences and uses it to create new kinds of knowledge and new forms of collectivity. Queer archive activism insists that the archive serve not just as a repository for safeguarding objects or ideas, but also as a resource that comes out into the world to perform public interventions. So this is a bit of what we're doing now to bring it back to CAS. So if we saw in the original description of CAS as a project that rejects pseudo-objective academic analysis, we can see that material semiotics, as I'm talking about it, embraces affect, emotion, and therefore acknowledges the care it invests in its subject matter and the care that motivates inquiry. It's not objective, not pseudo-objective, but invested in the outcome. It rejects the notion, in my view, that ethics, including principles of rights or justice, can exist outside of an interpreter from a God's eye view, and rather is rooted in a phenomenological ethics that is based in our situated knowledges, which, by the way, can be knowledges of a community, not just an individual. But we also have, as ideas that emerge from this, is that the scholar activist is always located in the work that she does. We're always located in our own work. Our own self is invested there. It's not objective in a pure sense, because that's impossible. But also that the scholar activist is the first and the most directly changed by the work that we do. So we're the ones that are most transformed by the work that we're creating and doing, and then effects on the world are secondary to that. CAS is a vital alternative to mainstream animal studies that sees non-human animals as signs, symbols, images, etc. So material semiotics has to be able to see animals as sign-making and sign-reading beings, as both of the talks that we just heard make reference to, that all animals are world-making beings rich in thought, in emotion, in sensation. So CAS, material semiotics, would reject anthropocentrism of value. Humans aren't the only ones that have value, but also recognizing that we're situated within the human. So we have a certain perspective, nevertheless, necessarily on non-human animals coming from the outside. It should emphasize empathy across species difference. Empathy can be seen as iconic or indexical based on resemblance and shared feeling. So empathy is within the purview of a material semiotics. And then I'll say that the CAS pursues interdisciplinary collaborative writing and research. This is the practice of knowledge production, trace making, and archive curation. And like queerness, much of what goes on in animal worlds is soiled and untidy. It escapes the archive. So monuments and texts have to be read according to absences and subtle traces as well as overt presences. CAS material semiotics is largely concerned with the curation of the animal archive as an embodied material practice. And as above with the queer archive, CAS material semiotics archive activism insists that the archive serve not just as a repository, but also as a resource that comes out into the world and performs public interventions. So I'll just close to say that the collecting and preserving and representing of animal traces, knowledge, theory, etc., towards the liberation of all beings is what I see as the curation of the animal archive as a material semiotic practice. And so the curation of the animal archive involves life tracing practices of our own stories told through the work that we do. And through the actions that we do, we create new understandings of human relations and human-animal relations through our own personal and public trace making about ourselves as animals, and specifically as animals with care for other non-human animals. And then finally, I'll just note that embodied curation activity takes place everywhere. So that takes place not just in our work as scholars, writing things up for others or presenting papers like these, but as an embodied practice in all forms, whether we wear a message on a t-shirt or hold a sign at a protest, those are semiotic activities, or as myself as an employee in a large local urban library system, just putting aphorism on the staff picks wall and things like that. Those are forms of curation that further the creation of another world, of new world, where humans and animals can live together in mutual flourishing. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Seth. Very inspiring as well. I invite everybody now to turn on your cameras, the panelists and the audience, so we can have a discussion and see each other and you can all participate. We have half an hour, for more or less half an hour, 25 minutes to talk about the papers. You know, you can raise your hand or you can write your comment or question in the chat if you want, and I will read it for you if you are shy. But the floor is for anyone who wants to start making any comment or question to our three panelists. Yes, Josh, you are the first one. Go ahead, please.
Hello, thanks very much. So my question's for Michelle and Erik. I really enjoyed your presentation. I really enjoyed dipping into all these different designs. But I have a specific question about one of the designs you talked about, which I think links into a broader puzzle I have, and I'd be really interested in hearing your thoughts on it. So it's about the fish watching. And my question is quite simply, is this a work of conceptual art, or is this something that is being proposed as as something we could do, like a real thing, something that anglers should take up instead? And so I say it links to a broader concern because it seems like some of the things you're talking about, so you talked about the design of urban buildings, you talked about, you mentioned t-shirt designs, for example. Some of these things are very practical designs that are out there in the world, right? They're things that are for sale or things that are being made. Whereas others, I mean, I suppose the ET on the spit is the best example. I mean, maybe I'm incorrect in using this phrase, but that just looks like a work of conceptual art to me. It doesn't seem to be a kind of proposal in any real sense. It's to alarm and to provoke and to make people think. So the broader puzzle, and like I said, this isn't really a question, it's more just a concern. The broader puzzle is about the different roles that the very practical design has from the very conceptual design, if you see what I mean. And from the outside looking in, I guess it's sometimes hard to know where things fall on that spectrum. So I wonder whether, whether there are distinctions to be made and whether it would be useful to make those distinctions, or whether it's just a kind of inherent problem when we're faced with these kinds of proposals. I hope that makes sense. But I hope at the very least the more grounded question makes sense about the fish watching.
Yeah, I mean, this is really kind of a can of worms, the design art spectrum, and we we actually removed a large section from the paper, which was about that. We didn't want to bring that up, no offense. But as you notice, like a couple of the projects are actually made by artists. So we, as design chauvinists, we have a really wide definition of design and what we include. But there is something to design which is about a context of use, I would say, and often relates to kind of everyday objects, everyday things, everyday activities, and which and then designers sometimes use tools and methods developed in conceptual art. And in terms of, so it's a mess, but in terms of fish watching, I think it's both. I mean, I tried to present it, the same concept can be presented both as this kind of snapshot from the future, but I mean, as I said, I can also go fish watching today, so it could be seen as a proposal, like as some kind of surrogate or e-cigarette for addicted anglers in a kind of transition phase.
So I ask what it looks like when you do it yourself. Are you just putting a camera on the end of a line, on the end of a rod?
Yeah, that's the current prototype. There are actually these miniature cameras that are marketed for fishermen, for anglers, with these slogans that said, "What could be better than catching a fish? It would be to actually see them take the bite, and to as this kind of bullying to add to the piercing is that you actually film them." But it's a long story. But yeah, so it's a reconfiguration of using existing props, which kind of tweaks this activity in certain ways.
Thanks.
Tom, if you want to take the floor.
Thank you. I enjoyed all those three papers. Thank you very much for those. I also have a question for Michelle and Erik, though. It's actually a question I've stolen from Bob Mackay. Bob Mackay was in the panel, but he had to leave, so I'm asking his question for him. He raised the question of food design, and he was thinking about all the many products we're now being assailed with from supermarkets. So not so much the in vitro meats and that kind of thing that you mentioned, but all these delicious delicacies that we're now being asked to buy. And I wondered if they fitted in as an example of potential CAS design in any sense. Would they fit your schema, your taxonomy at all? Or do they fall outside it?
Should I? Yeah, thank you for the question, Tom. Nice to see you also.
Yes.
Yeah, we did actually have some food design examples that we came across in the literature review, and we were having this discussion. Exactly, Erik, I don't know how we eventually decided to exclude it from this particular part, but I think it had to do with sort of the animal being present. But
yeah, I should have a good good response. But I mean,
I'm thinking about them. I mean, using your schema, if we wanted to push the case, we could make the case that, I don't know, I mean, think of whatever, you know, I seem to be buying new weird things in Sainsbury's every week as the different companies jump on the vegan bandwagon and sell me these preposterous things. And we could make the case that those are weird prototypes or even beyond prototypes, that they're imagining futures with that are CAS friendly, if you like. I suppose that's what I'm thinking.
But could you just mention an example
Oh my God, what was I eating recently? Oh, I don't know. I mean, endless pastries and pies and cakes and things. Some of which will be modeled on traditional ones, traditional, you know, meat containing things, but many not. Okay, sorry, so I'm not.
No, I mean, I like the ET project. That is kind of a food design, but it takes one step further in not just trying to, you know, look like the meat equivalent, but discusses in a bit the same way as the fish watching, kind of surrogate and placebos and replacements for not just the taste and the texture, but the other kinds of affects that are perhaps present in when eating animals. So yeah, so food design is definitely in there, and I think it can be in all of the different categories, depending on how it's prototyped or positioned or presented.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Any other comments? Yes, Martin, please.
Yes, thank you. Many thanks to all presenters, wonderful presentations, and they went together very well, I thought. My question is to Leonie, I just take the opportunity to ask one aspect which has already puzzled me before I listened to your presentation. I have to say I'm not a philosopher, but a music researcher, so ethics is not my field of expertise. I'm more into aesthetics, but as I have recently authored a paper with a colleague about the comparison of animal aesthetics and AI aesthetics, there were all those ethical aspects interwoven with it, and my maybe a bit my impression was that animal ethics are much more developed when it comes to fighting against anthropocentrism than AI ethics are right now. And I would be interested if you and your colleague have the same impression. AI ethics, with only few exceptions, always seem to be about how AI benefits humans or potentially harms humans, and how to avoid that or how to make use of that. And as sentient AI may develop in the future, and you mentioned strong AI, which would be sentient and possess general intelligence, maybe the question of protecting AI entities from being harmed by humans will come into the picture. So my thought was, if you bring together those two fields of ethics, there is the positive chance of AI ethics following paths that animal ethics already have well, let's say, developed, but there is this risk of, again, reducing animals to a very Cartesian mechanistic being, because that's the way many ethicists now seem to see AI, as just something very mechanical machine in a very emphasized sense of the word. And I'm just curious whether you have come across that when you prepared the paper?
Thank you very much, Martin, for this highly interesting comment and question. Well, where should I start? I think what you are referring to is not the broad field of AI ethics, but the so-called robot ethics. And there are also, like in animal ethics, many researchers are kind of experts in, and there are also many philosophers and of course others kind of experts in robot ethics. And when I started going into detail about this, I was very hopeful with exactly about what you are talking about, that it's also another way of criticizing anthropocentrism and yeah, going beyond all these demarcation lines. But I have to admit that I mean, I'm not that deep into robot ethics, but everything I have read so far, these researchers and philosophers are not discussing animals or animal ethics. And I was quite puzzled by this because, well, they claim that these machines should be seen as persons. They are claiming that robots should have rights and become legal persons. So they are claiming for these machines what animal ethicists are claiming for non-human animals. But they are not discussing what we are doing to these living beings. Well, I don't want to say at all, but it seems to me that they are still quite two fields of applied ethics not going together and discussing similarities together, but they are discussed completely, yeah, each field within their own expert group. And to be honest, it always makes me a bit angry that they are discussing rights for machines and just ignoring what we are doing to sentient creatures. So it would be a great chance to try to entangle these two fields of applied ethics, but in my impression, it's not done so far. So there is a long way to go.
Thanks, Leonie. If I may add something, I remember a presentation by, I think it was a German guest we had 1 year ago, just before the pandemic, at the Center for Animal Ethics at UPF, talking about robots ethics, and he was sort of an expert about, and he said that according to him, we will see earlier rights for robots, more rights for robots than for non-human animals, that because they are discussing that there is a huge discussion about this and it's progressing, and that it's very likely that we see successes in this area of robots ethics that will go beyond what we request for non-human animals. So yes, a little bit disgusting at least. Anything else? Yes, Michelle, please.
Yes, I have a question for Seth, actually, if I can, because I was very interested in your talk, and I saw also a lot of connection between the three talks today, so that was really nice. But I was thinking about also the work of Kohn and How Forests Think, but also perhaps Vinciane Desprez, like talking about different animal stories, and also Eva Meyer, when they're talking about the ways that animals sort of, as you also said, like make science and read science, and that in relation to the curation of archives or the making of archives, and I'm interested in that also in my current research, like how do animals speak within those archives, or do you have any kind of references or work or ideas or strategies for how to? It's a difficult question, perhaps, but and perhaps not really answerable, but the archives and the curation tends to remain very human-centered in that sense. It's like the human text and the images made by humans, and how do we broaden this up? Like, how can animals actually speak within those archives in their own ways, of course, not using like human language, but all their different ways of making meaning.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that's right. I mean, I think first of all, it's looking for those absences in the archive. You know, we have our human-centered archive, and then identifying the places where things are left out and trying to read those, you know, against the grain, so to speak, and seeing what's left out. And then there's places of, you know, animal resistance is another place to look at. You know, there's forms of, you know, sites, and people have written about this, where non-human animals are resisting human projects, and we can read those as expressions of those animals. And then there's maybe recordings in whatever medium of the non-human animal as expressing itself. Of course, that's through a human frame, nevertheless, because that's how we, you know, we're writing, we're creating, we're videotaping or whatever. But we have, especially now through non-textual media, we have more and more sites where we actually have expressions of non-human animals that can be seen and interpreted. So even though the human is holding the camera, you know, or setting the camera up in a certain place, or whatever it is, or the audio recording, or whatever medium we're trying to use, we nevertheless have these other animal expressions that come through. And so there's, you know, numerous examples of that where we could find, you know, on YouTube or TikTok or any place else, as well as traditional archives, where we have expressions of animals that are being made. But all those, you know, are filtered through the human, and I think that's one of the things to recognize, that meaning making, you know, is situated, and as humans we're going to be seeing things from within our human perspective, but we nevertheless can listen to these expressions of non-human animals. And there are some non-human animal archives we could think of, you know, collections of objects that non-human animals have gathered together, or trace making practices. You know, even an ant colony will leave certain traces behind for other ants. That's a kind of archiving practice, where a trace is being deliberately left for future beings to read and interpret. And so we can enter into those and listen. But a lot of the time, non-human animals are expressing in a way that's ephemeral. You know, it's in a moment, you know, making a bird call or what have you, but it's also performative. It's repeated. You know, the bird then sings maybe based on a memory of a previous bird, and so we can interpret those things in certain ways. And then I guess it's in these other forms of semiotic, these other semiotic dimensions, that we'd be listening to a lot of the time. Sometimes it's sort of linguistic or paralinguistic, but sometimes it's, you know, expressions of a yell, a call, and those things are legitimate expressions of emotion, of affect, of other things. As you may have heard this bell ringing in the background just now, which was my cat ringing the bell to be let outside, which is, of course, an expression of a non-human animal trying to communicate with me. I'm going to ignore him for just a moment longer. But, you know, we're surrounded by these things. You know, we can go outside and listen for a moment, and we hear expressions of all kinds. And the bird may be calling and saying, I am here, you know, in a sense to communicate to other birds its location. Or it may be saying, I'm a great mate, come find me, or what have you. But those are voices that can be listened to. So I guess for us as humans doing this kind of work, you know, there's ways that we can, with a critical perspective, start to collect archives of animal expressions and build those collections for future human viewers to read and interpret, so that we can hear that non-human animals are speaking to themselves, I mean, to each other, but we nevertheless can listen in and collect those and gain some information and knowledge out of that. So those are kind of my off-the-cuff thoughts about that. If I thought more about it, I could find some good references and stuff, but I don't know if that answers your question. But those are just some thoughts that come to mind here for me.
Definitely, thank you. And just to add that there's just such a huge design space there. Perhaps we're thinking of of ways to express these archives that fit better with the way that they are actually collected or expressed with other animals. So yeah, that's very inspiring actually. Thanks.
Yeah, yeah, and some of the best work I think is being done by designers and artists who are finding ways to represent expressions, non-human animal expressions, in ways that aren't just within the linguistic paradigm, because sometimes if you have a visual representation, for example, we can interpret that and gain meaning from it, even if it's not a linguistic expression about, you know, in the form of language, in the way that we often want to be based on. That art forms of art and design can, you know, touch us and give us insight and inspiration through semiotic strategies that aren't linguistic. So that's part of why we need artists and designers, in addition to scholars, to do this kind of work.
Thanks, Michelle, for your question. And thank you also before Martin and Josh. I didn't say thanks to you, only to Tom, sorry. We have 4 minutes still if you want. Tom, you still have your hand raised. It's because you didn't put it back. Okay. We have 4 minutes more if you want. Anyone want to say something else? Yes, Josh?
Thanks. I've already spoken, so if anyone else wants to speak, feel free to just interrupt me. But I had a question for Leonie, which feeds into the conversation that was just being had. And I appreciate that you might want to silo off robot ethics as a separate area. But I'm just wondering where you see, well, okay. It strikes me that among animal ethicists and animal rights advocates, there are kind of two camps, or maybe there's a spectrum. There's one camp that sees it as essentially the same struggle as for AI rights or robo rights or whatever you want to call it. So someone like Jeff Sable might be in that camp, for example. He seems very sympathetic to the idea of both animal rights, of course, and AI rights. But then there are others who I think see these things as sharply coming apart, right? In the sense that, and I think this is perhaps what was being suggested before, the pursuit of AI rights and robot rights is kind of a distraction. Why on earth are we talking about rights for computers when we've got literally tens of billions of animals being killed a year, right? So I wondered where you situate yourself and where you see your work. So I absolutely hear your suggestion that AI ethics needs to engage more with animals. But I wonder if you would put it the other way as well. Do we animal ethicists need to start embracing, you know, insofar as we are animal ethicists, I know you and I are, but maybe some others don't put themselves there. Do we need to be engaging more with AI? Do we need to be more open to AI rights, robo rights, you know, machine rights, whatever it might be?
Yeah, thank you, Josh. I think we definitely have to be careful because when saying what you just mentioned, that, okay, how can we talk about giving rights to robots when there are so many animals being killed? Of course, it's kind of what I want to say, but then I think, okay, this is exactly the same argument that it's being brought to us as well quite often. How can you care about animals when you see what people do to themselves, when so many humans are starving and dying in battles and so on? So since this is the same kind of argument, I think we have to be very careful about it. So in a way, I feel quite sympathetic with this robot ethics claims for also giving robots rights, because it is a way of, let's say, fighting anthropocentrism and fighting this view of us humans as being superior to all other beings. But still, I think we have to, I mean, this is my personal ethical standpoint, that I think it makes a difference if an individual is sentient and has interests or not. So I think there are still difference between machines who are not able to feel anything, feel pleasure and pain, and who are not able to being tortured, and individuals who are able to feel this. But of course, we have to think about this then in another way, when, as Martin also already mentioned, maybe at one point in the future, they will invent or produce robots who are sentient, and then yeah, of course, they have to be included.
Thanks, I agree.
Thank you both. Well, I think it's 2 o'clock, I think. So we have made it. If there is no any last urgent question, Mary is already applauding. So I think we can stop it here. Thank you so much to the 3 panelists and all the members of the audience making questions and the rest participating. And now we have lunch time and come back at 3, if I'm not wrong. Yes. So at 2 for you, sorry, 3 for me, at 2 for you, at 2 for the British time at least. Thank you so much. Bye.